Hey everyone, this is Ken Higgins, and I want to welcome you to Week 12's discussion on information seeking habits and collaboration. So, in the first reading, Lee and Kuthau wanted to answer a few questions, three specifically. What methods do information workers use to complete information seeking tasks? How do these methods change over time from an entry level position, higher ranking over time? And lastly, what specific skills can an entry level novice use to improve to become proficient in obtaining valuable information in a short period of time? So, to move through this, we're going to look at the case study. It was a longitudinal case study that was conducted on a securities analyst. In the field, information is extremely essential and is constantly changing. Over time, the test subject is categorized first as a novice during his first 3 years in the entry level position, and then eventually shifted to the expert level over the next 5 years that he was studied. The methods, criteria, issues, successes, and other data were compiled and analyzed. During this time, there were basically four domains or areas that were researched: uncertainty, complexity, construction, and sources. As a novice level in the first 3 years, the individual took on uncertainty with the industry that was ever changing, and the industry was trying to determine the industrial trends. Sorry, the individual was trying to determine the industrial trends. When the individual became an expert, uncertainty was not met with as much grace, as this was an indicator that there was going to be an immense information gathering task. He knew what he was going to be taking on, essentially. Previously, it was basically more of an expectation. As far as complexity, as a novice, tasks seemed to be more complex. As expertise and knowledge grew, these tasks were not as complex. Complex took on a much different face, in which several variables were in play and ever changing. For construction, when constructing concepts or interpreting information that was collected as a novice, he held an I have to be right mentality. That was the focal point. As an expert, the subject shifted to an emphasis that added value to a client's existing knowledge, highlighting proper interpretation of the information, as well as the ability to provide insight. As a novice for sources, the test subject sought out internal sources at first. This would include something like other sector specialists, such as himself, other than himself, sorry. And this was done basically for the sake of efficiency. Hey, you do the same thing that I do, real quick. Let me bounce this off you and get your thoughts. As an expert, he placed more value on external sources. This was achieved through building relationship during company visits to gain a better understanding of the industry as well as its dynamics. And the subject's use of institutional resources did not really appear to change and basically grew in this aspect. As far as our interpretation, or my partner's, um, the study shows that there are many factors that contribute to one's informational seeking process that is gained through application and situational experiences. Our perceptions of complex tasks change as we become more familiar with the subject matter. And in addition to that, my partner saw a strong connection in this matter. As a novice, having the right information as your mindset, then growing into an expert level in which we learn more from wrong information because it gives us a chance to sit and think why that information is wrong and all the different applications and facets that go wrong with it. Personally, I think that's exactly what good information professionals do: study the literature from multiple viewpoints, analyze the results, and discuss why certain information is either deemed right or wrong in its application. The next two readings kind of go along with collaborative information seeking, or CIS. And I thought this quote kind of stuck out to me personally, but also with some of the things that we've seen in the readings. One key element to team success is their ability to work together and seek information efficiently and effectively. So, up until this point, information gathering has been studied on a wide scale. But now we're specifically looking at seeking information collaboratively. So, what does this look like? What are some effectors? What are some triggers? In the second reading, there are two main questions that the researchers hold. What is the team's informational needs? And what are the situations that will trigger assist activity? As far as the study goes, this takes place in a rural community in a small emergency department. This department runs 24/7 or 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all throughout the year. At minimum, the hospital team consists of one physician, one charge nurse, two registered nurses, one technician, and a secretary. All individuals interact with each other and are essential for the functionality of the hospital itself. On occasion, there would be an additional member as minimally staffed, but not at all times, and that was an EMT or a paramedic. And they work within a capacity of a nurse. So to use this or conduct this study, an ethnographic study was used in which basically all the members of this group were followed and shadowed and were also questioned to get specific answers for their actions of why they did it. At the end, there was over 100 pages that were transcribed in which grounded theory was used to basically establish patterns that were supported by the data that was gathered. Out of this, we found 7 different categories that informational needs could be grouped into: patient specific, organizational, plan of care, miscellaneous, further details, teaching, and medication. In a hospital, obviously, this is very specific, and these would vary from place to place or job to job. There are 3 specific triggers that could lead to a collaborative information seeking event. The first one was the lack of immediate accessible information. So basically, a doctor does not have lab results that he had sent a patient over to another physician, like, say, a radiologist, to run a specific test. That test has not come back, and the doctor is lacking that information. Second, complexity of our informational needs. An example that was given here was basically a nurse has not taken vitals within hours, and the patient's state has changed. So let's say that the patient is now experiencing more pain. The doctor needs to know certain information, which requires another nurse to gather information and then share it with the doctor so the doctor can come up with appropriate treatment for the patient. The third is lack of expertise. Not everyone is trained in all fields of medicine. So, for instance, the physician is specialized in emergency medicine, but may not be totally up to date when it comes to radiology. So, for instance, if he has a patient and in the file is an x ray, he may not be totally for sure on what exactly is going on with those particular bones in that x ray. So, he would need to reach out to an expert, such as a radiologist, to gather more information on the patient. Some additional findings that were found at the end of this were some other patterns. The first one is informational breakdown. Again, from this, basically information is there, but is not passed on to the right person. Second is face to face interaction. It is so much faster and efficient for an individual to go from one source to another source directly versus sending an email or shooting a text. So face to face interaction was an effective manner to do so. The third, informal informational sources. There is a system in play at this particular hospital that charts and has a ton of data entry where you can get specific information on a patient. However, it sometimes is way faster to just ask a nurse who took those measurements. The nurse may not be totally 100% on that. So let's say it's temperature. The nurse may say, "Oh, he had a fever. I know it was over 100 degrees. I can't be exact." It's not totally formal, but it's enough information that the doctor needs. Does the patient have a low grade or high grade fever? Four, collaborative information and interruptive workplaces. We saw some patterns there. If you think about an emergency department, there's a whole lot of interactions. You have different nurses that are attending different patients. One might be coming off, one might be coming on. A charge nurse is trying to make sure that transition is correct. So you see information going in different places. As a result, you can see interruptions that occur as a result from that. And number five, organizational and technical design implications. Uh, Again, in this particular case, you see how the emergency department is actually run. Everyone is basically within close proximity of each other so that that face-to-face interaction can happen. And it's pretty straightforward. We need to do this as quickly and efficiently as possible because seconds count and people's lives depend on it. So, how the organization is actually designed, it's best to meet the needs of how fast and efficiently we can share information. As far as the technical design, the system itself could be taken into consideration how to quickly enter data, how to quickly extract data to get that information and share it. As far as my interpretation, I think it's really interesting studying a multidisciplinary team and what it takes to be successful. For me personally, having experience with this field in education, there are a lot of requirements. Essentially, effective leadership where members are held accountable. If you think of the emergency department, everybody has to be held accountable. There's a reason why there's laws and codes of conduct. All of these things have to follow a specific guideline in which people are held accountable because the alternative is catastrophic, could be someone's life. In my field with education, it's not nearly as severe, but there is a lot of examples where it's not on the same level, but can definitely have a catastrophic effect if there's a failure in leadership. Face to face is the fastest way to obtain and share information. I totally agree with that. That's why in our collaborative teams, such as we call them PLC, professional learning communities, we meet face to face. It's so much easier. It's so much more organic, and you can real quick have a access to a lot of information as well as clarifying on information that may not be clear at that point, but can real quick be answered with a follow up question. The timeliness intensity of SIS is case dependent. So for the emergency room, seconds count, like I said earlier, which it's life or death situations. Um, Others that may not be the case. However, time definitely does play a role in obtaining information that's quality and then applying it. As far as informational needs that triggers, or of triggers that lead to CIS, in my career with education, I listed a few: disciplinary action, lesson, curriculum writing, student achievements, school functions, interventions, and action plans. All of these are time sensitive, and all of these require effective flow of information in order to achieve any objectives in those areas. So essentially, the success of my teams are heavily impacted by the effective communication and understanding and appreciation of everyone's skill sets and proximity. So we're all pretty close. We all get along. Yes, there's a cultural component, which will be addressed in another article. But overall, there's a lot of factors in play that allow us to share information very quickly and collaboratively. The final reading that I picked, I thought was kind of interesting because it took a look at the social context of using a social network analysis of communication for research. So in this one, the researchers basically had like four hypotheses in which two of them were broken up. The first one is the extent to which one seeks information from another is a positive function of the extent to which both individuals share previous interpersonal relationships. So, in short, the effort that you put into information seeking is going to be largely impacted by how closely related you are to that person. Two, very similar, but in this case, we're looking specifically as social identity, such as group or nationality. In the third hypothesis, this is where it gets a little interesting on the take of it. States that individuals from a collectivistic culture are more likely to seek information from in group members that are those from an individual culture. Individuals from an individualistic culture are more likely to seek information from the outgroup members than those of a collectivistic culture. So, in short, collectivistic versus individual culture. Collectivistic, you're going to see we have our own norms, we have our own acceptances, and we don't like to go outside of that. We like to stay within it. Whereas the opposite for individual culture, where it's I don't care who you are, where the information's coming from. I'm going to take a look at it and I'm going to see the validity in it. Um, Four, information efficiency expectancy will positively influence information seeking across group boundaries. So within that particular group, if you think of like a virtual class such as ours, that could be a particular group in which we're thinking about internal boundaries within our group. Social outcome expectancy will positively influence information seeking within the group boundaries as well. Okay, so let's get rocking and rolling here. As far as the case was set up, the article runs with a lot of complex modeling. So, I mean, I really had to start looking into this and thinking back in my undergrad of taking meta-analysis and stuff like that. And yeah, so let's get rock and rolling. The article runs with a cisdirection, but specifically examines intercultural computer-mediated communication groups. Okay, so within our class, say like such as ours, that's virtual, how do we interact with each other? And how would we interact with, say, another section of our class from another university? That's kind of what they're doing here. So basically, the researchers had 86 undergraduate students that volunteered, but there's a little twist. They were also given extra credit for this. Anywho, there were three different universities that participated. One of them was from the United States, and then two of them were from Singapore. So you may hear me refer to Singapore 1 or Singapore 2. That's just to try to shorten it, if you will. But there's three universities total, 28 students from Singapore 1, 27 from Singapore 2 or S2, and 31 from the US. Of the 86 students, 51 of them were female and 35 were male. So we have a collaborative learning practice that was generated, and they call this social remediation practice. There are basically two phases to this, in which each phase was 2 weeks long for a total of 4 weeks. So it didn't really take that much time to gather this data. Phase one, all students had to do was basically find an online article that had to do with a current issue that was in communication technologies. Then they wrote a summary on it, kind of like what we do every week. Phase two, students pick up a peer's article. So for 2 weeks, they go through all the postings that were on this one particular platform, and then they wrote their own personal opinion about the topic. So they had a follow up. There were really no stipulations into who they had to. Like in our class, you have to respond to anywhere from 2+ peers, and there's certain criteria for those postings. This was just in general reply to anyone you want to. A specifically or specially designed web discussion board was used in order for them to communicate with each other. So not necessarily Canvas, but something potentially like it. And then at the end of this entire study, there's also a survey that was given. Now, back into the complex modeling for this whole entire thing. With all the data that was gathered, you think of it as like having three different groups. You have United States, Singapore 1 or S1, Singapore 2 or S2. There are a couple of different ways to generate an analysis here. One was called a MVP or multi-level logistic regression analysis that was conducted. So in short, my understanding was Basically, predictions are made from one network, so say like the United States, and then it's applied to the other networks using the same parameters to make predictions, right? So we would take what we did from one university in the US and compared it to S2 and S3 to generate predictions. Then the same thing was done with Singapore 1. Singapore 1 was made that model, and from there it made predictions for US and Singapore 2, and then on and on. From that, we have a ton of data that can be used to compare to each other and identify trends or outliers. In addition to the MVP, we also have a QAP, quadratic assignment procedure. So from here, you take the data from your dependent variable, it's scrambled several times through several permutations, and from this yields a huge set of data that can be basically analyzed. So from all of this, in short, here's what they found out. And this is the most simplistic graph here that I saw in it that made the most sense. If you look at the United States, out of the second phase, those last 2 weeks when you had to reply to another peer's paper and put your comments on there, the United States had 17 total posts. So basically, a lot of people weren't doing their homework. But anyway, 8 of them replied to other US students. 6 of them were replies to Singapore 1 students, and 3 of them were replies to Singapore 2 students. So basically, the US kind of went all around the whole smorgasbord, if you will, of replying to people. For Singapore 1, though, they're in Singapore 2, none of them actually made replies to any posts from the United States. Instead, they stuck with individuals of like culture. So Singapore 1 or Singapore 2, they replied to each other. This whole finding kind of validated and supported the first two hypotheses. Basically, the extent to which one seeks information from another is a positive function to the extent to which both individuals share previous interpersonal relationships. Makes sense. The second one was validated as well, such as the extent to which one seeks information from another is a positive function to the extent to which both individuals share the same social identity, such as group or nationality. Moving forward, this is where we start to get a little complicated. All these different regression analysis models were used, and from this, they started to see that, in fact, hypothesis 3 and 4B were supported. 4A, not so much, but both of 3A and 3B were, and 4B were. So, in short, social outcome expectancy definitely has a positive influence on seeking within group boundaries. So, within our group, you'll see even a cultural mix. Sometimes individuals of the same nationality or culture, or in this case, social group, will interact with each other more than people outside of it, even though we're all within the same section of the class. Above that, individuals of collectivistic culture are more likely to seek information from in group members than those that are from an individual culture. So basically, you're in my culture. I want to stick with someone within my culture that has the same kind of values and understandings. I'm going to get information from them first. Whereas individuals from an individualistic culture don't really care where that information is coming from. They're kind of receptive, whether it's from in group or out group members. In short, in conclusion, I should say, the researchers found that interpersonal social networks, as well as intergroup boundaries, are limited and restricted by collaborative information seeking within a computer supported environment. So basically, that makes sense. You're going to see interpersonal social networks and cultural boundaries within the group that are going to have an impact on how and who we get information from. Second, national culture had a direct effect on the social context in which collaborative information seeking was conducted. Again, that makes sense. Um, I'm going to wait to kind of expand on that until I get to my interpretation. So I think that cultural and social boundaries definitely limit the engagement or flow of information within a collaborative group setting. And at first, when I really thought about this, I was a little bit naive. I was thinking back from, say, undergrad when I first went to school. You go into Mizzou, you go into a lecture hall, there's several hundred people. We all have different backgrounds. Some of us, are from similar situations. We might see somebody even from high school in one of our classes. But for me, being more individualistic, I'm very objective based. I really don't care who you are, where you come from, or your ideologies. If we have a project together, I'm very objective based. I am interested in those other things, such as, the differences between us in terms of culturalistic or social differences. I find those things very interesting, and honestly, like, I don't, how do I say this? I enjoy being around individuals that think differently or are differently than me. It makes me kind of take me out of my bubble and look at the world a little bit differently. Not everybody is like that. And after reading this and thinking about it, that does make sense. In some cultures, uh, it's very, very different with how open you are, how you share information, how you get information, how you approach others, who you don't approach. So I definitely see that as being a restriction on here, whether it's, hey, we're all in the same class at Mizzou, or I'm in an information science technology class here in the US, and I'm reaching out to a section in Singapore. We're doing the same stuff. We might even have the same professor, but I'm not going to see the same kinds of interactions, if you will. So it took me a little bit of thinking about those barriers, but I definitely do see how those exist. Um, in addition, I found it interesting that although technology connects individuals globally and it also reduces geographic limitations, that this whole cultural and social component is a huge thing that I don't feel like we've fully understood yet or fully researched as we are with the technology itself. I feel like emphasis previous to this is, all about the technology. How do we apply it? How do we use it? And those are the restrictions that come with it. Now we're focusing more on, okay, we have all this stuff, but how do we work together to share this information? So, again, just reflecting on my educational journey, I've always been objective and open when working with my peers that were from all over the world. However, now looking back on it, I could definitely see how some individuals may not have been as open as I was. And from this, we can definitely start to see a breakdown or regression in information sharing. So, in short, I hope I didn't bore you all to death. I appreciate your patience and kindness, and I hope you found some of this interesting. So, let's go ahead and get to our discussion questions. The first one was created by my partner and took a look at mindset of the test subject. So, as a novice, the test subject thought tasks were more complex. So, again, novice was the first 3 years of when he was in the industry. So he thought all tasks were pretty much complex. And the quote goes on to the perception of the complexity of a task, rather than the actual objective complexity itself, seemed to be the critical factor in experiencing uncertainty. So, from this, what are some implications to the statement above? Second, Hansen and Jarvlin from 2005 found that awareness of workers that they have in relation to their team members and the work activities or responsibilities that they have are a contributing factor to the success of the collaborative information seeking activities. Do you think that this would have a greater, equal, or lesser impact on a small rural hospital like Regional Hospital in the case study than compared to a much larger hospital? So, does that dynamic have a huge impact on a small setting versus a large group setting? Explain your thoughts. And then finally, number three, Cho and Lee use Hofstede's 1991 National Cultural Model that basically treats all individuals of a nation homogeneously in relation to their cultural values. Do you agree that this model is accurate? Why or why not? All right. Well, I wish you all well, and I look forward to your comments in our discussions. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. I appreciate it. Thank you, and take care.